Hi, I'm Ben Graham. This is an introduction to international political economy, and this is our second lecture on comparative advantage, and we're actually kind of running through four different things today. We're going to talk about the capital to labor ratio in comparative advantage. We're going to talk about political institutions as the source of a lot of comparative advantage. We're going to talk about sort of education and contract enforcement and all these sorts of things. We're going to talk about the terms of trade between countries. Okay, once we've established that two countries can trade in ways that make them both better off, who gets to keep most of those gains, right? And the terms from trade can help us identify who's keeping most of the gains. And then we're going to talk about volatility, and we're going to talk about commodities. We're going to talk about, we're sort of easing into one of the real substantive questions of this course, which is trade good for poor countries, right? The economic nuts and bolts here are fine and good, and they're really important. We can't do anything without them, but there are more normative, more policy-oriented questions that are fundamentally what we care about. And we're really starting to get close to those today as we're talking, as we're talking about political institutions, as we're talking about where comparative advantage comes from. That's a lot of domestic policy-making choices, right? And then when you get down into the terms of trade, and who's getting to keep those gains from trade, we're really getting into, what will sit beneath the negotiation of trade agreements. And when we're getting into our talk about volatility and when free trade is or isn't good for poor countries, right? Really getting into this, how do poor countries become wealthy? So we're starting to link up to some of these bigger questions. Okay, so let's start with the capital to labor ratio. Right, and we're thinking about the capital stock per worker as kind of the way to think about this capital to labor ratio, right? Every worker in the country, how much capital are they paired with, right? And so remember, when we're thinking about capital, kind of the way to think about this is this a worker who is digging in the dirt with their bare hands to farm? Is this somebody who has a hoe? Or is this somebody who has a plow and a horse? Or is this somebody who has a tractor? Or is this somebody who has a self-driving combine with drone guidance, right? Like at what level of capital are we pairing with that single worker, right? Similarly, kind of like, are they sitting there with a sewing machine in a giant kind of concrete building, or are they working alongside a robotic arm on a really high-end manufacturing line, right? How much capital is paired with each worker in this economy? And you can see, so this is really quite dated. This is from, 20 years ago, kind of this, when at a time when Japan has now kind of fallen off of where they were at. South Korea has really, South Korea is essentially no longer a developing country right there. They're solidly a middle income and country and really an upper middle income country. But you see kind of a distribution and actually Kenya's come up quite a ways since here. So you've seen some adjustments. You can kind of see richer countries tend to pair a lot more capital with their workers, right? As a country gets wealthier, one of the things that accumulates is capital. Okay, and what you're going to see is where you have more capital per worker, you have higher wages, right? So, if you go to Norway, you have a ton of capital per worker, and you're going to see, supermarket checkers making the equivalent of 40, 50 bucks an hour, right? That it's labor there gets very, very expensive because, they have so much capital per worker. Okay. The capital to labor ratio, right, and then the wages that workers are making is going to shape what countries have comparative advantage in what types of products, right? So if we look back to the early 2000s when China was just joining the World Trade Organization, this was at a time when wages in China were still pretty far below wages in Mexico, right? And, this was really, the early 2000s when China was kind of the t-shirt factory of the world, right? Was really doing a lot of low-end manufacturing, doing it at a absolutely world-class pace, right? But wages were quite low and they were cranking out really labor-intensive goods, right? But, as China has just grown by leaps and bounds, that capital to labor ratio keeps going up, right? They're, sure, their population is growing kind of steadily, but not that fast. And their capital is accumulating really fast. And wages keep being driven up, right? Which means China's no longer the most competitive place in the world to make T-shirts, right? Like now that has moved to Cambodia and to Vietnam and to some other countries, right? And China is moving kind of up the value added chain. They're doing increasingly more complex manufacturing, more high-end manufacturing. That requires a lot more capital per worker and a much more educated workforce, all these kinds of things. Similarly, Mexico's, in contrast, kind of Mexico's manufacturing wage has been pretty stable, right? We think a lot about kind of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement from the US perspective. It was recently renegotiated, and we'll be talking quite a lot about that in a few classes. But from Mexico's perspective, a lot of what they'd hoped to gain through NAFTA, they ended up losing out to China, right? Where a lot of the production that they were hoping, a lot of the manufacturing they were hoping to do in Mexico ended up moving to China instead, essentially. And now we actually, in 2020, manufacturing wages in China are actually notably higher than in Mexico on average. And so we've kind of, China's kind of passed Mexico by during this time period. So these are things that evolve and change over time. And as this capital labor ratio changes over time in countries, it changes who is competitive making what. And when you don't have a lot of capital per worker and when your wages are low, you're globally competitive making really labor intensive products. Things like T-shirts where you just need kind of a cheap sewing machine and somebody sitting in front of it for long, long hours, right? That's sort of the ultimate kind of labor intensive manufactured product. You get toward, making silicon chips and things like this, and you've got a lot of capital for each worker, and it's a pretty different manufacturing process. Okay. So capital labor ratio is a real important determinant of comparative advantage. Where do you make T-shirts versus where do you make iPhones versus where do you invent iPhones, right? But political institutions do a ton to shape this. And if you think about like how do political institutions shape comparative advantage, this is, this gets really into comparative political economy too, sort of like what is this link between political institutions and economic outcomes, right? Well, when we think about why economies look the way they do, why countries are good at making what they're good at making, a lot of this has to do with past investments made by the government. How healthy is your workforce, right? Those are past investments in the healthcare system, right? How educated is your workforce, right? How much human capital exists in your economy? That's all about past government investments in education. And how much physical infrastructure do you have? Right? Do you have a good road network? Do you have sophisticated ports? Do you have airports that allow you to fly, high-end products out? Do you have a great internet grid, right? Reliable electricity is a huge thing. There are a lot of countries, even fairly high up the income ladder, where major cities, whether it's Lagos or elsewhere in the world, that don't have a reliable electricity supply, even though they have they've got towering skyscrapers and some real high-tech stuff, but the power grid is not reliable in most of the city, right? So, so this infrastructure plays a lot in what you can then be globally competitive in. But another big thing besides, so obviously like health and education and infrastructure, those are huge, but governments also provide the rule of law, right? And the court system is incredibly important in shaping what countries are competitive in. And here we're talking especially about what we call transaction intensive industries. You can think about those as industries where lots of things change hands back and forth, where the contracts are really complex. You can think about things where lots of lawyers are involved and there needs to be a lot of ability to enforce really complex contracts. There's a reason that Wall Street is located in the United States, right? That we have a huge financial industry in New York. And if you look at where are the big financial centers, right? And it's places with really strong contract enforcement. It's Tokyo, it's New York, it's London, right? Singapore, right? But London and New York are really still just the big global finance hubs. And it has to do with the efficiency of contract enforcement. That ability to, like, a trade goes sour, somebody backs out of something, you can unwind those trades and enforce those contracts. And you actually see, if you've got a Brazilian firm making a contract with a Russian firm, they'll often write the contract to be enforceable by the courts in London or in New York, right? A lot of international business is done in London and New York to take advantage of the legal services there. So, Britain's legal services industry, ton of lawyers in London. And it has a lot to do with multinational corporations writing contracts with each other that are enforceable in London, right? And it's also why you have a finance industry in London, New York. It's all about reliable contract enforcement, which takes a long time and a lot of money and a lot of government investment, and a lot of, frankly, a lot of sort of checks and balances to get a reliable contract enforcement going. Sort of corruption and reliable contract enforcement do not go nicely together, right? It's also the case that you get a lot of comparative advantage from a political institution by attracting smart and talented people, right? That the most talented people, well, nobody likes to live in repressive states, and highly talented people with a lot of really economically valuable skills tend to have good luck gaining admission wherever they want to go. And so whether this is sort of thinking about in terms of all the scientists and intellectuals that fled the Soviet Union for Europe and the US, or a lot of the Jewish scientists and intellectuals who got out of Europe in the 1930s as the Nazis were coming to power, right? You have a lot of different times in history when folks who have a lot to offer economically were fleeing repressive regimes to places where they could be safe. You get a lot of global talent kind of redistributing based on where they can be free from political repression. So there's a lot of different channels that link political institutions to comparative advantage and to what countries then end up making and trading with one another. You're taking this class with a political scientist, so it's not a surprise that you're going to get a version of this where politics are kind of the whole story here. If you kind of want, I guess this slide is probably one of the most important in the class, right? In terms of laying out things that really matter in explaining why the world looks the way it does. This is a very crude picture. The index of democracy that's on the y-axis here is a super crude democracy measure. But what we're seeing is just sort of this correlation between democracy and GDP per capita. And by and large, the only really rich countries, the rich autocracies that you see are mostly Gulf oil states, right? If you have oil, you can get quite wealthy even without decent contract enforcement or education or roads or any of these kind of public goods type of things. But by and large, the highly democratic states tend to be very wealthy. And this is, causation is going in both directions here. It's both the case that democratic governance tends to be quite good for economic growth, and it's also the case that wealth makes it easier to sustain democracy. Both of those things are true. Okay, so if we're heading back at the really big picture here, right, and trying to get at whether trade is good for poor countries, how poor countries become wealthy, right? We've come this far on comparative advantage and kind of gotten to this. Comparative advantage is this magic where when two countries trade, both countries can become better off. But how are those gains from trade divided, right? Who benefits more, right? And also closely related to this, why is it that countries don't always benefit from trade? Right? If you take a straight econ class and you look at nice toy models and you're like, looks like everybody should always be better off here. But that, in practice, that has not always worked out, right? We've seen some situations where opening up to trade and international finance have led to some really nasty crises, financial crises in poor countries, right? So we're going to talk about why trade openness is sometimes really dangerous for poor countries. We'll be getting to that with the volatility piece here today. So, I'm kind of going to cruise through this slide, but it's kind of reviewing, anchoring back to this idea that countries specialize in the things they make most efficiently, right? And it's not sort of perfect, if we try to sort of look at the unit labor costs here in different areas and look at what the US and Japan are exporting back and forth to each other, we kind of see that this tracks, but not perfectly, right? So it's a pretty good predictor of what countries are going to make. But what I really want to focus in here on is terms of trade, right? Where the marginal rate of transformation, which we were talking a lot about last lecture, and which you definitely want to review until you've really got that clean. The marginal rate of transformation it establishes the worst deal you're willing to accept. It's sort of, this graph kind of shows there's two places two maxima we can get to here. If we go beyond this way, we're better off not trading. One of the partners becomes better off not trading. But we have this whole wedge in which both countries are better off. But if we're down here, closer to the US marginal rate of transformation, right, then Canada is capturing all the gains from trade. And if we're all the way up at Canada's marginal rate of transformation, then the US is capturing all the gains from trade. So we're always gonna, kind of theoretically, we're gonna live in this world where both countries are made better off than not trading, or else they wouldn't do it. But, we can end up in a world where one country is getting 98% of the gains and the other country is getting 2%, right? Like there's nothing that says these gains from trade are going to be divided up equally. Okay, so we want to get at who's going to capture these gains from trade. There are, and obviously there are more than 2 countries in the world, and right, so we've got a lot of products. It's easiest to talk about this with products that are things like commodities that have a global price, where kind of a barrel of oil is a barrel of oil is a barrel of oil, or at least a barrel of light Texas sweet crude is a barrel of light Texas sweet crude, and so on and so forth. So it's graded at different weights and that sort of thing. But same thing, sort of a bushel of wheat is a bushel of wheat. These are pretty interchangeable. We don't, an iPhone is not quite the same as a Samsung Galaxy, right? It's not quite the same as a Pixel, right? So, those are a little bit less interchangeable, but a bushel of wheat grown in Russia and a bushel of wheat grown in the US or soybeans or whatever are pretty interchangeable with each other. So they have a global price. You can say, this is the price of oil on the global market. This is the price of wheat on the global market. So when a large country enters the global market, right, if Saudi Arabia puts their oil production onto the market, or if the US puts their wheat production onto the market, that act of selling into the market is actually, it's such a large amount that they're selling that it's moving the supply curve, right? That the entry of the US into a market is actually going to move the curve and is going to change the price. So if the US starts to sell a bunch of stuff, the price is actually going to fall, right? So coming into a market as a big player, you move the prices against you, right? If a small country enters the global market, let's say that, you've got something like, Sudan starts pumping a little bit of oil, or, and Sudan, and they start to sell in the global market. Sudan's not such a big producer globally that they're really going to move that global price, right? So Sudan gets to sell at the global price without moving it. Saudi Arabia starts to pump, doubles their production. That's actually going to move the world price, right? Okay, and so this gets to price takers versus price makers. And if you ask an economist what's driving who gets to capture the gains from trade, they're going to point at this mechanism about, are you a price maker or a price taker? How big is your economy? And an economist is going to tell you a story that they'll tell you about the importance of being unimportant. It's nice to be a price taker. It's nice to be one of these small players where you don't move the market. Then you get to trade at somebody else's terms of trade because they move the market and you don't. And that's fine as far as it goes in terms of like, yes, if you have a lot of assumptions in place, then that's going to work and that's going to make good predictions about the price and the terms of trade under some limited conditions. But as we'll kind of see going forward, the politics of trade agreements are going to have a lot to do with what the terms of trade look like as well. And so economic models that leave tariffs and trade negotiations out of it are often not going to do a very good job of predicting the terms of trade. So I don't want to tell you that this mechanism is unimportant. It's important to understand, and it does help us understand when a country entering a market is going to move the price or not. When big country, when big producers or big purchasers enter a market, it's going to move the price. When little purchasers or little sellers enter a market, it doesn't. And that's very good for little purchasers and little sellers. Unfortunately, there's some other contexts in which it's not so good to be little, because when you're little, you're weak, right? When you're big, you're powerful. And that, and countries are able to use power to shape markets, right? They're able to use military power, they're able to use diplomatic power, right? The markets are not, economists often assume away the politics, and the politics are very, very important. Okay. Terms of trade, we've got to define what this is, right? So we've sort of told you, like, the marginal rate of transformation, and it tells you the worst deal you're willing to accept before you walk away altogether. But knowing the marginal rate of transformation of each country that's engaging in trade doesn't tell you, it tells you the bounds around, the price is going to fall somewhere in here, but it doesn't tell you where. So the relative power of the two countries negotiating trade agreements and stuff, that's going to matter. The importance of being unimportant and sort of that, how big, are these two players, that's going to matter a lot. but how do we track sort of what the terms of trade are? And it's really hard to do because countries are selling a ton of things and buying a ton of things at the same time. And so when we think about like, is a country getting a good deal in their trade, right? We talk a lot about, you know, like in the trade war with China, like, is the US getting a good deal when we trade with China? How do we know? How do we measure that? How do we even think about that? Terms of trade are how we think about that, right? And so all we're doing here is we're picking the current prices and we're saying, okay, prices as of 2010, we're going to call that the starting point. We'll call that index 100. And then we can look at how things change over time. We're going to index together the prices of everything we export and stick it over top of the prices of everything we import. And we'll say, okay, so the prices, the averaged indexed out price of everything we imported in 2010 over the, or everything we exported in 2010 over everything we imported in 2010, we'll call that index 100. You know, just baseline that at 100, and then we'll see how the prices of everything we export are changing over time, how the prices of everything we import are changing over time, and that'll tell us whether the terms of trade are getting better or worse for us. Now, the key thing here is that it doesn't tell us whether our terms of trade are better than China's terms of trade. It just tells us like, are US terms of trade getting better or worse over time? Are Chinese terms of trade getting better or worse over time? So we can tell you one country, are you improving or are things getting worse for you? But it can't tell you kind of who's winning. Let's take a look at this. So if we set, you know, in this case, you know, we're just looking at moves between 2000 and 2008, right? So we set the index at 100 in 2000, and then we see how it moves between 2000 until 2008. And these are, you got an export price index, an import price index, and thus the terms of trade. So if you look for Australia, so particularly at the time, but even still now, Australia is a major commodity exporter. And between 2000 and 2008, commodity prices shot through the roof, especially for a lot of the minerals that Australia was exporting. And so between 2000 and 2008, you know, the price of the things they were exporting went up almost 3x, right? That's huge in 8 years, right? So boom times for Australian exporters, right? This was great. And the stuff that they were importing, it was getting more expensive. Over 8 years, it got 50% more expensive, you know, went from 100 to 149. But, you know, the price of what they were importing went up a lot less than the price that they were exporting. So their terms of trade got a lot better between 2000 and 2008. When commodity prices go up, life is good in Australia, right? Now, if you're Japan down here, the things that Japan was exporting between 2000 and 2008, a lot of the high-end manufactured goods and this kind of stuff that Japan's exporting were pretty flat in price, right? You actually had a lot of competition coming online at that time. For a lot of the things that Japan was exporting. And so, so you didn't see a similar boom in the price of what they were exporting. Whereas the things that they were importing, which include a fair number of raw materials and these same things, these commodities that were zooming in price, you know, those were going up quite a lot, you know, 80% over these 8 years. And so their terms of trade got a lot worse during this period. And then other countries are kind of in the middle there. So when essentially, you know, this makes good intuitive sense. If the stuff you're selling is getting more expensive over time, it's going up in value, more money's coming in the door. It's great, right? It's great when the stuff you sell goes up in price. And similarly, when the stuff you buy gets cheaper over time, that's great, right? And when the stuff you buy gets more expensive over time, that's really rough, right? And so that's all the terms of trade help you track. Is the stuff you're selling going up in price faster than the stuff you're buying? Or, you know, and that's how you know whether trade is sort of progressively becoming better for you over time or worse. Okay. So, but if we really want to get at this, is trade good for poor countries? We've talked about how small economies have the most to gain from trade, right? So in the sense that when they enter a market, they don't move the price. So it's easier for them. They're more likely to be able to trade at the other state's marginal rate of transformation or closer to it. So they're likely to reap, you know, in a market that has no politics affecting it, they're going to get a higher share of the gains from trade. But it's also the case that autarky, which is when you don't trade with anybody else, when you're totally self-sufficient, that's a lot more plausible if you're big, right? In other words, like not trading really sucks if you're little, right? So you think about like your Peru, right? Okay, let's say you decide, no, we're not going to trade with anybody at all, but I'd still like to have a car to drive, right? Well, now you got to deal with the Peruvian-made automobile, right? Like, you know, Peru is going to be so much worse at making cars than Ford is, or than, you know, than Honda is or something like this. Like, you're going to have to deal with a really inefficiently made car, right? You're going to have to deal with there's certain things, like if you're a small country, there are going to be certain things that you need that are really important that you're just terrible at. If you're a really big heterogeneous country, like you're something like the United States, you've got some regions that are good at this and some regions that are good at this and so on and so forth. And there's nothing that you're so terrible at, or there's not too many things you're so terrible at. Well, okay, autarky becomes a little more plausible. It's a little more plausible to cut yourself off from trade and be okay. If you're small, it's really rough if you cut yourself off. You have to, doing everything yourself when you're a small country is not so efficient. Okay. So in general, like there's some good economic reasons to think trade is a really good idea if you're a small country, right? Most poor countries have small economies because even if your population is large, when you're really poor, the total size of your economy isn't that big, right? So in general, that should tell us, if we just take these sort of toy economic models, trade should be really very good for poor countries. But there's a couple of reasons why it can end up being a mixed bag, right? Volatility is a big one, and then global trading rules are the other, right? So we'll talk about both of these. So first is that when you open up to free trade, right, you specialize. That's the whole origins of comparative advantage are about specializing in the things that you're good at, right? Instead of making both wine and cloth, you go all into wine or all into cloth. You go and spend all of your time doing the stuff you're best at. That's how we get these gains in efficiency. That's where the magic of comparative advantage comes from. But another way to say that is the magic of comparative advantage is putting all of your eggs in just a few baskets, right? So you are increasing risk. At the same time, you're increasing efficiency, right? You're increasing risk. You're making your economy more fragile, right? Instead of your economy being spread over 50 sectors, now it's spread over 5. If you get a recession in 3 of those 5 sectors, your economy is toast, right? So it makes you a lot more, the income in your country is going to be a lot more volatile, right? This is the same thing with like stock market, with playing the stock market, right? If you have all of your investments in 1 or 2 stocks, your returns are going to be super volatile. Whereas if you buy a mutual fund where you're buying into 500 different stocks, those returns are going to smooth out a little bit more, right? You're going to have lower volatility with a more diversified portfolio. Well, I mean, comparative advantage is all about specialization, not diversification, right? So you're going to get more volatility. This is going to work at the individual level and at the national level. So at the individual level, this displacement from trade and the volatility in individual incomes, rich countries deal with that with the social safety net, with taxing the winners and shifting those tax dollars to the losers in the form of unemployment insurance and food stamps and health insurance for the poor and those kinds of things, right? Poor countries have more trouble doing that. They often don't have the government capacity to do the tax and redistribute, and taxation is a smaller share of global income, of national income. Just the tools to redistribute are usually less well developed when a country is poor, right? But it's also the case that poor countries tend to be commodity dependent, and so their specialization is even, so it's not only does opening to trade mean going into fewer sectors, but those fewer sectors tend to be commodity production. And commodity prices relative to the price of manufactured goods tend to be even more volatile, right? So it's really difficult if you're a poor country and you've specialized in these commodities. It's hard to adjust your economy when commodity prices fall, right? We kind of saw how awesome it was for Australia when commodity prices surged as a major commodity export. But when commodity prices crash, that same thing happens in reverse, and it's really devastating. And the next slide is kind of going to walk through why volatility is so rough when you're poor. But I also want to sort of flag here that the global trading rules tend to favor rich countries because rich countries with big economies are super powerful politically and militarily, right? And this is sort of coming up next week, more talk about it, but this is in some ways kind of the biggest reason why free trade can be bad for poor countries. It's that the rules of the game can end up and do end up stacked against them. But let's talk about this volatility piece first. Get a little bit of hand-drawn stuff. So what we've got here is we've got 2 different income lines here. We've got the volatile income, right? Which on average, you kind of average across this whole time period. Let's imagine kind of time is on the x-axis here. So the individual or the country with the income in this black line makes on average more than the country or the individual with that red line, right? But this is the stable income. Now let's imagine that this country or this individual is pretty poor. So they're close to this line of subsistence, right? So let's talk about this at the individual level first. So this is your income falls below here and you can't eat enough to survive. You can't buy enough food to survive, right? So it's great when your income is high and you're actually have some disposable income, you're doing really well. And it's nice during these time periods, right? It's nice to have a higher income and you can send your kids to schools and you can buy more clothes and you can maybe even buy a car, right? You have like a higher standard of living. The problem is when you dip down below subsistence, you die, right? So the stakes are just too high, right? Like you cannot, if you are a wealthy person, right, and your income crashes, right, you dip into your retirement, you take out a loan, you borrow money from your parents and move into your parents' basement, right? When you are wealthy and you have a cushion, right, you can deal with that volatility. So you might choose the higher, more volatile income because you have the ability to make it through the lean times, right? If you are at a lower level of income, you might need to choose the more stable but lower income option because you cannot afford to fall below that subsistence level because if you do, you die, right? Like the stakes are just too high of what that dip will do to you. There is no safety net, right? So this is true at the individual level. It's also true at the country level. So what does it mean for like a country to fall below subsistence level in this sense? Like think about government income, so the government tax revenue, right? Dipping below that subsistence level is the point at which the government can no longer pay salaries for the military and the soldiers come out of the barracks and overthrow the government kind of thing, right? Where you can no longer function as a government in a way that allows you to keep basic order and to remain in power, right? To prevent sort of dissolution of the state the way, a la Somalia into a failed state in the 90s, right? So that's why this volatility, it hits much harder if you're poor. So opening up to free trade and accepting that trade-off of we're going to be more efficient, we're going to be wealthier, but we're going to have our eggs in fewer baskets. And so we're going to be more volatile in the first place. And then it happens that our baskets are the commodity baskets, which are extra volatile baskets, right? That's, free trade can be really dangerous, even when we leave political power out of it. Opening up to free trade, the volatility that comes with it can be really dangerous for poor countries. Okay. If we look a little bit, one last, and we're sort of heading toward the end here for today, but I want to talk about sort of commodity prices, this point that they're super volatile, right? So there's a really interesting kind of historical a story here with this guy, Paul Ehrlich, who is the author of The Population Bomb, which was this book that was essentially saying, look, we've kind of, with vaccines and a lot of this other stuff, we've reduced child mortality, we've enabled people in a lot of developing countries to have much lower mortality rates and populations are booming. We're going to be headed toward this age of mass famine and this age of scarcity. And Julian Simon was this other thinker who sort of countered and said, no, look, if you have a shortage in something, that's going to lead the price of that thing to increase. That increase in price is going to drive the incentives for innovation, and you're going to find a good replacement for that thing that became scarce, and prices are going to go back down, right? And the classic example here is copper, right? Which used to be used in pipes and cookware and all these different things. And, and there's still a lot of copper piping used in houses. But as the price of copper spiked, there was an increased incentive to innovate and to think about like, well, what else can we run water through other than copper pipes, right? And that was really when PVC pipes, these plastic PVC pipes became onto the market, which are way less expensive than copper piping, right? And so this increase in the price of copper led to the development of this new technology, right? And then the price of copper collapses, right? And so even if the global population is growing over time, and even if, that leads certain raw materials and certain minerals and things like that to become scarce, right? Well, then innovation kicks in and we'll find replacements to those things, right? That's sort of the cornucopian theory. And so these two individuals, they did something that is intellectually fun, and I think intellectually useful. They put their money where their mouth was, right? And they made a bet. And so they made this bet in I think in 79 or maybe in 80. And they bet whether or not they picked 5 metals, and they said, okay, well, let's just pick 5 commodities here, and let's bet on whether they will rise or fall in price over the next decade, right? And so Ehrlich is saying, look, these things are going to go up in price over time. Price is going to go up, up, up. We're heading for this age of scarcity. And Simon's like, no, over time in general, these things are going to be dropping because they might go up for a little bit, but then you'll have innovation and then they'll fall. So they make this bet, and Simon won, that this basket of 5 metals was cheaper in 1990 than it had been in 1980. Now, I mean, obviously their argument isn't specific to this decade or specific to these 5 metals. And if you pick different baskets of commodities or different timelines, you might have had Ehrlich winning the bet, right? But the thing about global commodities, and this is sort of a commodity price index, is not that there's some clear trend where it's going up or down over time. And you'll see there's been then a fall again after 2011. But it's mostly that they're really volatile over time, right? And so that's the thing that ends up being really dangerous if you are a small economy that's highly specialized in a handful of commodities, and that's all of your export income. It means when those commodity prices crash, your whole economy goes in the tank all at once, government revenue, everything else. And that's really, really dangerous. So that volatility itself becomes a problem. All right, and that is where we'll end for today. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you all for the live section of our class.